Welcome to the Health Science Podcast, sponsored by the National Health Association. I'm your host, Dr. Frank Sabatino, and today I'm absolutely delighted to have as my guest Sarina Farb. Sarina is a kind of a vegan activist. She is a science educator. She's been involved in a number of things. One of the co-founders of the International Vegan Summit on the Vegan Earth Day Summit, and also the co-founder and co-director of the 2020 Climate Diet Summit, has been involved in numerous presentations online and in other media, things like Vegan from Birth and Plant-Based Policy and Eat to Save the Earth. And I'm just so happy to have you. Welcome. Thank you for being with us.
Welcome to the Health Science Podcast, brought to you by the National Health Association, the oldest organization in the world, championing the extraordinary benefits of a whole plant food diet and healthy lifestyle, as well as water-only fasting. We believe that health results from healthful living and focus on evidence-based science that promotes the health of you and your loved ones, as well as the health of all animals and the environment. We feature experts from a cross-section of disciplines within the plant nutrition, vegan, psychological, environmental, and animal compassion sectors. I'm your host, Dr. Frank Sabatino, the NHA's Director of Health Education.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I'm looking forward to this.
You're also the founder of your own channel and site, Born Vegan. I want to make sure that I emphasize that. And we're going to talk about that anyway. Sarina, when we go through this, many times people will often muse at, what would it be like to have somebody that didn't come late to the party, that was actually born and raised strictly from the beginnings of, veganism in their lives. So let's get it straight from the mouth of the herbivore. You started from that point, and let's talk about the early beginnings, because you make the point that beginning really is what really opened your mind to be much more of a free thinker, that really kind of set the tone for the wonderful and amazing things that you've been doing in your life. And I got to give kudos to your parents. So I would love to know a little bit about that background in Kansas and all of that stuff that was part of your life.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a very unique upbringing and background for sure. And as you mentioned, so I was born and raised vegan in Kansas, which everyone's always surprised when they hear that. They assume like, oh, if you were born vegan, it must have been New York or LA or something like that. Right. And no, it was in Kansas. Both of my parents were actually also born in the Kansas City area. And my mom had a job working for a pharmaceutical company in the 1990s. And her job took her to tour animal testing labs, chicken hatcheries, and pig farms at times. And so she went vegan when she saw the inside of our food system, essentially, and also knew she'd always wanted to have children. And she didn't just go vegan. She saw what she saw and basically asked the question of how could she raise children who would never go along with the things that she saw people going along with, who would stand up and speak out when there was a harm or injustice against innocent beings happening in front of them. And so she decided then she wanted to raise her children vegan. And keep in mind, at this point, she had actually never met another vegan in real life.
That's yeah, when you think about it.
So yeah, here she is, vegan, just gone vegan in Kansas City. And she's like, I also want to have vegan children. Never met someone else who's vegan, don't know anyone else raising vegan kids, doesn't know if this is, possible or safe. And she was very determined. And she met my dad, who was like a meat and potatoes guy and definitely not vegan. And she basically got him to agree to raise any kids they had vegan and keep their home vegan. And by the time I was about 6 months old, he was also vegan from, hearing everything. And she started, doing research, going to the medical library to figure out, like, is this actually safe and healthy to raise vegan children? And she got Dr. Michael Clapper's book from the late 80s. I think it was one of the first books about raising vegan kids. And she started, reaching out and meeting other people, none that really lived in Kansas City for the most part, but she attended some vegan conferences and started to get involved with activism. And so then that's kind of the environment that I was born into. And so from a very young age, we were talking about veganism, and it wasn't just like a diet or a lifestyle. It was this whole framework of, we stand up for justice, we speak out against injustice that's happening in front of us. And I mean, she also was definitely a health nut, and cared about all of that as well.
Well, the bottom line is, at that point, your dad, and were you in regular school, or were you homeschooled through that?
I was homeschooled. I ended up going to high school and did different things throughout school, but when I was really little, I homeschooled.
But so grammar school level, you are homeschooled pretty much. And I noticed the activism started early. I saw that at age 14, you were actually protesting against a Kansas coal plant. Talk about that. That when you think about that, you think kids are going through their own adolescence, all the angst that goes with that. So tell me how you were focused enough at that point to have that kind of, or to start really expressing that kind of voice in your life, because obviously it became a big part of who you are.
Yeah, absolutely. I think for me, it actually really even started younger. It started when I would really say when I was around 7 years old, because that's when my parents gave me my own food choices. It was kind of like, up until that point, they had been reading labels. They'd been saying, oh, no, that's not vegan, or, oh, we don't eat this, or we don't eat that. And when I was 7, they decided that now that I could read, it was up to me, outside our home, of course. They were like, our home will always be vegan. We're still going to buy what we buy. But if you're at school or at a friend's house, or, doing something else, and someone offers you food, we're not always going to be there. So you're going to have to learn to read labels and make informed food choices for yourself. Right. And so part of what came with that was, my mom created this stack of about like 40 flashcards that had different ingredients like gelatin, casein, whey, red dye 40, artificial colors and flavors, all these different things that I might read on a package that either weren't vegan or weren't healthy things that my family consumed. And so I had to learn to read these ingredients. And then the other side of the flashcard basically said what it was, how it was made, and why we didn't eat it. So this was when, I'm 7 years old, and I'm learning what gelatin is, and that it's all the leftover slaughterhouse byproducts and all these different things. And so my parents had always explained veganism to me really simply with, terms like, we love animals, we don't eat them, or cow's milk is for baby cows. And it always made perfect sense to me. So then when I learn, oh, these other things really hurt animals, or this is gross and disgusting, and why would anybody want to eat this? The way I think my parents explained it to me was well, we know this information, not everyone else does. And so other people who don't know this information don't choose to do what we do. And in my 7-year-old brain, and this was, I feel when I really became an activist, it was well, if other people don't know this information, I better tell them. I need to spread this and share it. And so I started going around quite literally and telling friends and other people. I would read ingredients and look at things and be like, oh, that has gelatin. Do you know what gelatin is? Let me tell you how gelatin is made and why it's disgusting and you shouldn't eat it. And so that really started with that information and knowledge when I was about 7. And it kind of went from there, because I always cared deeply. And hearing about environmental destruction in the world, hearing about what happens to animals, always made me really sad and upset. I think I watched, also around the time that I was 7, I watched The Blue Planet documentary. And there was a 1-minute clip in there of the Amazon rainforest being clear cut and burned down. And I remember that one scene, it made me sob, and I was so upset. And I just went around for the next 3 weeks, talking to everyone about the Amazon rainforest, and was can you believe what we're doing to the planet and animals? We have to stop this. I have to stop this. I just always had this burning passion when I would learn about bad things happening to the planet and animals and other people, and wanted to use my voice to speak out. And so then, and as part of our homeschooling, my parents really facilitated that as well. And so we would get civically involved and learn about local developments and the coal plant that they were trying to put in Kansas that the environmental community was really fighting. And so as part of my homeschooling, my parents were like, let's go to these hearings, let's go to city commission meetings, let's get involved. And I started writing letters. And so then I was actually I was a very weird child. And I was very, very excited that for my 14th birthday, I was going to the Capitol to go to a rally and speak out against the coal plant. And I actually made like the front page of our local newspaper. It was like, for her 14th birthday, Sarina Farb, speaks out against coal plant. And I was like, other kids are, having parties and eating birthday cake, and this is so much better. I'm fighting for a better world.
The question that comes up when you think about it, many times people will educate children early about certain things, but there's always that time when you get into teenage years where there's a certain kind of natural rebellion. And a lot of times you're rebelling against what your parents actually were trying to share or maybe even impose. It seems like you never went through that. And that's kind of an intriguing thing, because that's different in itself, because most of the time there'll be some degree of rebellion against what you perceive as the parental input or the status quo input. But in this case, you held your ground, which is kind of intriguing. So kudos to you, because it's not an easy thing to do, and it's not typical at all. And I'm sure you saw that probably in some of your own friends and people you interacted with through those years of your adolescence and teenage years.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I definitely was not your average child. And I think there's several reasons why I don't think I really had that normal rebellion. One is, especially around the topic of veganism, it wasn't like, I think my parents were really smart in that they sort of gave me my own food choices when I was 7. So it didn't feel like from that point onwards that they were forcing it on me. It was like, obviously it was still what we did in our home, but when kids would ask me, even from starting at 7, they'd be like, oh, why can't you have this? And I'd be like, oh, I can. I choose not to. So it really helped me feel empowered and own the decision for myself. Like, I felt like my parents were like, here's the reasons we do what we do. And it wasn't just, this is what we do, we're forcing this on you. It was, here's why we do this. And having that reasoning, that logic, that information, growing up, getting to go to farmed animal rescues and sanctuaries, meet animals, there was never any question in my mind that was something it would just, it made perfect sense to me. I will say, I think my rebellious years were pushed off a little bit more towards college. And that was when I kind of rebelled on some of the, I would say, more health side of things, because I didn't just grow up vegan. Like, my parents also, we ate mostly whole foods, plant-based, and home cooked meals. We hardly ever ate out. We didn't eat fast food. I'd never eaten at a McDonald's or Taco Bell in my entire life. Burger King, even to this day, I've never eaten in Burger King, never eaten at McDonald's. And I have since tried Taco Bell once or twice, but.
Well, we're going to take just a very short break. I'm here with Sarina Farb from Born Vegan, and we're going to take a short break and hear from our sponsor, the National Health Association, and we'll be right back.
You're listening to the NHA Health Science Podcast. Dr. Frank Sabatino here. Are you ready for an extraordinary adventure that combines relaxation, exploration, and vibrant health? Then set your sails for the NHA plant-exclusive cruises. Imagine cruising through exotic destinations, savoring delectable plant-based cuisine, and engaging in rejuvenating activities, all while surrounded by like-minded individuals passionate about health and wellness. These cruises offer more than just a vacation. They offer an opportunity to immerse yourself in the NHA's principles of healthy living. And they rank incredibly high on the ratings of eco-friendly cruise lines. We all know how important our oceans are, and our cruise partner, Windstar, is fully committed to this. Join us aboard our upcoming plant-exclusive cruises and experience the synergy of health and leisure. Delight in gourmet, SOS-free meals prepared by talented chefs. Attend informative workshops and enjoy the serenity of the sea, all tailored to nourish your body, mind, and spirit. For more details and to reserve your spot on our next adventure, visit healthscience.org and click the link under travel. Don't miss this chance to indulge in a wellness retreat like no other. Elevate your well-being and make memories that will last a lifetime. And remember, your feedback matters. Please take a moment to leave a rating and a review wherever you're listening to the NHA Health Science Podcast. I'm Dr. Frank Sabatino, your host. Now, back to the show.
Welcome back to the Health Science Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Frank Sabatino, and we're here with Sarina Farb from Born Vegan. And yeah, let's take it a step further, because now you're going through college years, you're doing your thing. And I know that one of the things you're very much involved in, and I'm going to have a pretty extensive talk with you about this, is the role of science in society. And I think it's a really important discussion, because you had an inclination, you went in the direction of studying biochemistry. And I know you wound up teaching science for a period of time. And I know you give a number of discussions on the role of science in society, whether it's in whatever platform you're dealing with. So let's talk about that, how that interest generated for you and how you moved into that biochemical world, and what science meant to you in that journey as you moved forward in your life.
Yeah, that's a great question. So part of my homeschooling through like the middle school and high school years was I competed in the science fair every single year. I did that for about 8 years straight, almost, competing in the science fair every year. And by the time I was getting into high school, I had sort of seen other really sophisticated projects, and I knew that the science fair world had lots of opportunities. A lot of people don't realize, like when I say science fair, they think about a school science fair, and they don't realize there's national and international science competitions that if you win some of these local science fairs, you get all expense paid trips to compete in at the time it was the Intel International Science and Engineering Competition, or the National Junior Science and Humanities Symposium. And so I started seeing kind of people a couple years older than me doing really sophisticated research, like at the university level, and entering into these science fairs and getting really cool opportunities. And I started kind of really being interested in that. And so my junior and senior year in high school, I got into a lab at the University of Kansas and started conducting cell biology research there, and was actually researching the effects, if you're familiar with it, of like bisphenol A, BPA, the chemical in plastic that people, talk about being a xenoestrogen. So I started looking at the effects of BPA and the replacement compound BPS and their effect on like breast cancer cell growth.
You were doing in vitro cell studies, is that what it was? Okay.
Yes. I was working with breast cancer cells, tissue cultures. And so I was really getting to sort of see like way beyond the high school level into like what research, and really getting to follow a question and, take, these questions about the health and safety of chemicals and foods and things in our environment, and was really seeing how I could apply that and do essentially, publishable research. I didn't end up publishing anything from that experience, but I was working with grad students in this lab and learning cell culture and, sterile technique. And it was really, really exciting to me. And I loved doing the research. I loved reading the primary literature, learning how to understand and read things that were way above my level of basic biology knowledge at the time, and sort of teaching myself all of that information so that I could do this research and then be knowledgeable enough to talk and present and write a paper about it. And that's kind of what got me into the research route. And at the same time, it really melded with my critical thinking and sort of activism experience, because I also started seeing, even at the high school level, the role that industry played in biasing some of the outcomes and awards and research. And several years in a row, I participated in a biotechnology competition. And one year I had a judge tell me afterwards that he didn't vote for my project because he disagreed with the premise of it. And I was like, what do you mean? I was like, I have this review of literature that's got 50, peer-reviewed published studies cited in it that kind of make the case for my research. And he was like, well, I work for the paper industry. I don't think BPA is bad. And he was like, so I didn't vote for your project. And I'm like, so you ignore, like, what do you think about the 50 citations and the other studies, And he was just like, I just think it's wrong. I just think your project was wrong. And I had several experiences kind of seeing that, again, even at this high school level, you get sort of industry involvement meshing with like what research. I can see clearly how like this industry involvement can determine what research gets published, what research gets publicity and talked about versus others. And that the bias isn't so simple as, oh, like this was a fake study or something. That like, depending on how you design a study and the parameters and things you choose to measure and the outcomes, you can bias the results of things. And so this, I feel like, was really, really key in showing me, like, I continued to be passionate about science, but also really passionate about true, clear science seeking to find answers, and the difference of that from, industry biased science that has an agenda, which we can see when it comes to the promotion of like meat and dairy products and things like that. And so it really taught me critical thinking in like how to read studies, how to look at the study design, how to ask, deeper questions about how things were designed and what was measured and what outcomes were possible. And that led me into wanting to study biochemistry and kind of go down that research path for a while.
So you did that through your college years, the biochem studies? Is that what you did?
So I went to a different university, and so I did biochemistry. So I wasn't working in the cell biology lab. I did that through high school for a couple of years and through the summer. And then I went more the biochemistry route, and I thought about kind of going down the non-animal testing route, like trying to find alternatives to animal testing in research, because that started to become frustrating. There's so many animal products, even in vitro studies and cell biology. And there's a big push for, in vitro not meaning much, and you need to do the in vivo animal studies and things like that. So that was my interest for a while, and I did some research and work in some labs with alternatives to animal testing, and really just became more and more interested in that time about speaking about veganism and sustainability and animal rights, and kind of left the lab research world behind.
Well, it's intriguing because the more advanced you go into science, the biases become way more sophisticated. And that's the problem, because one of those issues is it actually gets covered into layers and layers of, if you will, ambiguities and other kinds of things. I spent 10 years in science at the highest level. My PhD is in neuroscience. I did brain research for 10 years, chemical research for 10 years. The bottom line is you have those issues that support hypothesis. Industries, even universities are being funded in certain ways, and you can't always see the clarity of the layers of that funding. Sometimes it's very difficult, whether it's behind, the Rockefeller organization, and we see that very much in drug studies, which
Absolutely.
Are really trying to really sell. A classic case was the recent stuff with vaccination for COVID. I mean, a lot of that data is generated in a way that was overlooking some of the most powerful interventions, specifically plant-based eating, and ways to eliminate infection that were, zoonotic infections from animals to men. So a lot of that gets overlooked. So it's frustrating. And I know part of what you wanted to do, and part of what your interest is as a science advocate, is to bring a certain kind of social justice, compassion, and heart to research. So before we do that, let's let people know where they can find you. I want to make sure we don't overlook that. So what's the URL you want them to go to learn more about you and what you're doing?
bornvegan.org. You can sign up for my email list, follow my YouTube channel and Instagram pages, all from that website.
That's beautiful. So bornvegan.org. So let me ask you this, because I know it's passionate for you to link a more ethical base to the research that's done to bring this sense of heart and compassion with ethics into a more just scientific approach in society, so that we are not dealing with the biases of corporate entities or corporate sponsors that have their own agendas. So let me ask you this, as you have moved along in your life and you have thought about that and you have addressed that, Give us some feedback on how you feel you've actually affected that in a positive way. I'm just curious how that's played out in your life.
Yeah, that's a great question. So after kind of leaving the science world behind for a little bit and doing some work in the nonprofit and activism sector, then I ended up teaching chemistry and environmental science in high school. And I really brought that approach to everything I taught. And I kind of told my students up front, I would say things like, I'm not here to tell you what to think. I'm here to teach you how to think. And that's really the heart of science. And I think it often really gets, kind of misconstrued or portrayed as like this set of facts that we memorize. And especially in high school, kids think like, oh, I'm just supposed to memorize this and that. This is this fact. And don't realize like that science is always changing. The more data we collect, the more information we collect, our theories, our hypotheses, our beliefs on things change. Like it's not set in stone. And I really tried to emphasize that and teach that science is a method and way of asking questions, collecting data, and forming, theories and belief systems, but that we have to be open to that new information and not just kind of get stuck in our ways. And so I really, I had so much fun teaching high school and really trying to teach critical thinking through science, and created my own activities where we were, I was trying to teach them at the sophomore level how to read a peer-reviewed paper and how to like analyze parts of it and ask questions and, how to look for bias in articles and things like that. So I did that there. And then when I started my Science is Gray podcast a couple years ago, that's kind of what I did with all the interviews I have on there. And my approach was really, I think, again, science is not black and white. And especially through COVID and the pandemic, and when we merge, mainstream media and advertising with science, we get this idea of, and this was thrown out a lot, of people are either pro-science or anti-science. And I think sometimes legitimate questions about bias, about studies, about things where someone's not anti-science at all. They just are either criticizing corporate profits or bias or have questions about how things are done. And that gets grouped into something they're called anti, when like it's trying to create this idea that like science is this set of beliefs, X, Y, and Z. And if you don't believe these, 5 things, then you're anti-science. And it's so not black and white. And so my goal with that podcast was to really, bring on people who truly, I think, see the nuance in science, people like Dr. T. Colin Campbell and, Dr. Milton Mills, who talked about how there can be institutionalized racism in the dairy and, with dairy and the nutrition guidelines, like all these nuances. And hopefully that reached a lot of people and got more people thinking critically about the role of science in society and how to look at things with more nuance.
What people don't realize, and this was something that was put out many years ago by Jeremy Rifkin, who's one of the great thinkers, I feel, economically, but when you look at the evolution of science, what happens to too many people is they don't understand the philosophy of science that was behind how we look at science. And this is very important. Many, going back into the 17th century, one of the granddaddies of the scientific method was Sir Francis Bacon. So they were the architects of this mechanistic worldview that we still unbelievably still operate in. But the goal at that time was to create a body of objective knowledge by creating what he called the scientific method, which is still the method that still plays. Mm-hmm. The only problem is that method separated the observer from the thing being observed. And what it did is, in the collection of objective knowledge, the philosophical framework set up a situation where nature had no intrinsic value. The only value that it had was in the way that it could be monetized into wealth in terms of property or the availability of resources that it provided. So as much as that's an archaic way of looking at nature in the world, unfortunately, that still operates philosophically within the way we still do science. And I think it's led to the ongoing crisis that we have in climate and environment, because we still look at the accumulation of wealth and material wealth and materialism as the real value that nature has to offer, rather than respecting and accessing its intrinsic value and supporting that. So unless you understand that philosophy, it's hard for scientists and even the entire scientific world to revamp that paradigm so that there's respect for the natural world, because we live in a time when there isn't. And the atrocities and the injustices that go on because of the way we produce food and industries and the like are still operating from this very ancient paradigm that needs to be discarded. And hopefully as we move forward, we can do that and start to see the real, and I think we're doing that. We're seeing the intrinsic value, because if we don't recognize it and work with the free flow energy systems that we need to be more conservative, we're going to lose the planet and we're going to lose each other. So I think the whole compassionate approach with veganism really can help to revamp that paradigm. Just that a lot of people are not linking those two things, that philosophical framework, the way they should. So I don't know if you've given that any thought or thought about that process, but that's a big part of the problems with science. Because while science gives us a lot of how things are done, it doesn't tell us the why, and it doesn't address that. And that's something that we have to, in our heart and in our compassion and in our work, come to some place with that. I'm just happy that you still use the V word. I've been dealing with so many physicians and so on that will not even entertain the idea of vegan, because they associate it with, sometimes foods and things that are not wholly plant-based. And so they've kind of discarded it. But it's such an important philosophy that deals with doing no harm and compassion and so on. So I always try to resurrect that in all the times that I talk and work. How do you feel about that? I know that you feel that way probably too.
I love that. I mean, I'm still using the word vegan and everything, and I have my whole life. And I think it's so important because, I like to distinguish too, between vegan and the ethic that means, right, and then diet, right? So it's like, I'm vegan because of the animals and not harming others and wanting a better relationship with us and the other, beings on this planet. But as you said, like, lots of people jump to like, oh, that means you're eating Oreos and potato chips and junk food and all of this. And it's like, veganism is actually not a diet at all, any more than not eating cats and dogs is. It's like simply a principle of justice and compassion. And you can eat a healthy, whole foods, plant-based diet. You can eat oil-free. You can eat junk food. It's like if someone tells you that they're against eating cats and dogs and they rescue cats and dogs, you don't immediately go, oh, you must be a junk food eater. It's like they're almost not connected at all. It's like one is a principle of justice and then diet. And it's like you can eat anything under the range of veganism, just not animals and sentient beings, but all of the plant kingdom, all these other things. And so I'm vegan for the ethics, and I think that's important, and I use that word. And then I also say I try to eat pretty healthy and be whole foods plant-based, and talk about the science and the power of a whole foods plant-based diet to heal many, diseases and things like that. But I distinguish them a little bit.
Have there been any issues in your life or in your family's life where you've seen health benefits that really were addressed by this? Or were there any crises that came up that you saw this as such a viable option to reverse serious pathology? Has that been any experience in your life of that?
A little bit. So, I mean, my family has been pretty healthy, thankfully. I know that my grandfather had actually been diagnosed with like angina and heart disease back in the 80s before I was born. And he actually learned about Dean Ornish's work and I think he went plant-based for about 10 years, even before I was born. So this happened mostly before I was born. But he was at various times had heart attacks, strokes, a stent put in. He had all kinds of health issues. He would eat plant-based and then he'd sort of say like, oh, a little bit won't hurt, and then fall off the wagon and have another health issue and then go back to, eating healthier. But all in all, it's like for having been diagnosed with like heart disease back in the 80s, he lived until he was 94 and passed in 2020. And so I got to have, a relationship with him and know him up until I was an adult. And, and even in his later years, my parents were still feeding them, my grandparents green smoothies and bringing all of this. And, I think that probably really helped extend his life and the quality of his life from, the fact that various doctors at various times predicted he would never live that long. And then in my personal life, like I'll say, and of course, I think veganism is one factor to this, living a healthy lifestyle as well. But, I pretty much have almost never used pharmaceuticals in my life. Like I took my very first dose of antibiotics 2 years ago for a tick bite. And before that, had never had antibiotics in my life because I'd never needed them. I've still never taken a Tylenol, an ibuprofen, an aspirin, like these things that I think so many people use on a daily basis. And I, that's not because I've like avoided them at all costs. It's because I've never really had any issues serious enough to need pharmaceuticals or anything like that. And I think that's, pretty rare. A lot of kids grow up having ear infections, and mucus issues, largely from dairy consumption and things like that. And so never having had, another species breast milk and not eating the flesh and, animal protein, certainly don't think it has harmed me. I think.
Definitely. And I think most of the docs like myself, Michael Clapper, all of us that have taken care of vegan families for decades can resonate with what you said. We see the elimination of any of these childhood illnesses. We see a freedom from pharmaceuticals. But let me shift the discussion in one direction, because you have had a mindset for vegan activism for a very long time. And, the foundation of veganism is really in many ways to create a more compassionate, loving world. I mean, we can, I think, agree that that's a big foundation for what we would like to see happen. But when we come to these injustices that can make us angry and upset, talk about how you bridge the gap in that stand of trying to still come from a loving place to create a very vivid activism rather than sometimes the angry militant approaches that can sometimes be. I think that's an important discussion, because sometimes it's almost as if people think I'm going to just be angry and upset, and somehow that's going to still create a compassionate, loving world. And in a way, that's not congruent, so to speak. So what do you feel about that, and how you tie that vegan activism into a more compassionate, loving approach?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, and something that I've definitely had evolving thoughts on over the years. I have been involved in and tried lots and lots of different activism. I tend to have been throughout the years more on the education side, whether that's the speaking or tabling, and less on the, protesting disruption side. In the last couple of years, I have gotten more involved in, pressure campaigns and some of these more radical disruptions. But personally, no matter what type of activism I'm doing, my feelings are that we have to be the change we want to see in the world. And so telling people, go to hell or shame on you, it's like, I don't want anyone to go to hell or be shamed. And I think there's a big difference, I will say, between guilt and shame, because I've had people, when I've been doing outreach or tabling, tell me like, oh, stop trying to guilt me into this. And they'll say that because I've handed them a flyer that says that dairy comes from a grieving mother, that milk comes from a grieving mother, which that's not shame. That's not anger. That's not using hatred. That's just sharing facts and information about the reality of the dairy industry. And so that's why I think it's really important to distinguish. If someone sees educational information, hears a lecture, watches a video, and then they feel guilty about their choices because of that, that means that their actions are out of alignment with their values and that they should probably change their actions. I don't think there's anything wrong with people feeling guilty, but that's very different than me going up and saying, you are a bad person because you eat dairy. That is shame. Shame says that the person is bad and sort of irredeemable. Guilt says that the action or choice is bad, not the person. And so that's kind of my approach, is like, I don't personally at this time want to be involved in anything that is directly attacking or shaming people, because I think we do have to embody the change we want to see. We can't, if we're putting anger and hatred out into the world, no matter how righteous it may be or how justified it may be, that's not the kind of world and interactions I'd like to see. So I want to come from a place of peace and love and compassion. But that doesn't mean, some people take that, I think, the wrong way and are like, oh, well, I want to hold people accountable. I need to tell them the truth. You can still tell people the truth, right? It's not coming from a place of anger or hatred to say that animals are exploited, or that, a cow is hung upside down in a slaughterhouse and has their throat slit. Like, that's just a fact. And if someone's bothered by that fact, they should probably change what they're doing. I can love someone, I can, treat them kindly, and I can still share the truth with them. And that's kind of my approach to balancing
Absolutely.
that.
So let's talk about the Born Vegan program that you have, your site, your YouTube. What is it that you really are hoping to truly accomplish with that? And how are you doing with that accomplishment? Let's talk about what it's about and how you affect people and people's lives with the approach that you're taking.
Yeah, so my approach really is to basically ask people what their values are and if they're living in alignment with them. So I used to, try so hard to sort of just logically argue with people, challenge their philosophical beliefs. And I've found over the years that, this is kind of a more popular saying these days, but unfortunately, logic and facts don't change people's minds. I think emotion, personal reasons, selfish reasons, but especially emotion, people connecting with an animal, seeing something that really affects them emotionally, the state of our planet, seeing someone reverse a disease in their life. Like, I think these things are actually way more powerful for affecting change on an individual level. So when I go into my speeches or workshops or lectures, I kind of start off by saying, like, I'm not here to tell you what to believe or convince you to change your mind. I'm here to ask you, because I believe most Americans especially already are animal lovers. They care about the planet. They care about health. They care about their loved ones. I think most people, in many ways, already agree with the premise of veganism. So I go in with my work basically saying, what are your values? Ask yourself that. Do you care about peace? Do you care about justice? Do you love animals? Do you care about stopping climate change and helping the environment? Do you care about health? And if you do, are you living in alignment with those values? Are you making excuses, or are you taking actions that put us further on the path toward the kind of world that you say you want to see? And so that's kind of my approach to everything. That's, when I make YouTube videos and Instagram videos, I'm putting out, ideas and facts and information for people to think about. But really, it comes down to, like, at this point, if you care about these things, are you living in alignment with those? And how can I help you, live in alignment with those? I have a vegan starter guide on my website that people can download, and it's got, a compilation of my favorite facts and information and tips for people to get started from a very practical standpoint of, I believe these things matter to you. Now let's take actions so that you actually are living in alignment and will be, I take a holistic approach too. So I want people to be healthy, thriving, emotionally, also healthy, empowered vegans. So while I do want people to quit eating animals for any reason and however it takes, I don't really go around promoting like the junk food vegan lifestyle, because I think to make it sustainable, like, people should probably do their best to feel healthy in their, bodies and lives as well. And emotionally, they need to find connection and community and not just be isolated, because you're going to burn out really fast if you feel like the people you're surrounded with don't support your choices and are attacking you. And, I want to help people find their voice and find the way that they can contribute to making this world better.
Yeah, some people argue that when people are making change, they're going to make it within their time frame, within whatever they can do. And sometimes they're making smaller changes to get to bigger changes. Mm-hmm. Other people would argue that the time for incremental change is way past. The house is burning and we need to do something much more vociferous. So how do you feel, how is your tolerance for people making, those choices within where they are and getting there slowly? Because sometimes that's what it takes for someone who's lived a lifetime of eating and living a certain way. And if they can even stop eating meat and then stop doing this and then change that. And so how is your tolerance and how do you feel about that dance Are you comfortable with meeting people where they are, or are you at a point now where you feel you have to kind of scream the message that the time for incremental change is probably past?
Another really great question. I think I sort of take a balance, and I do that by, kind of choosing the time and the place. So when I'm putting content out on social media that's going to a whole audience, or making a video, or writing an article, or giving a speech, I'm putting out, the time for incremental change is past. We need change now. But if I'm talking one-on-one with an individual who's like, okay, I agree with you, I want to make these changes, then I'm not going to say I have tolerance for, baby steps. Like, my message is still going to be, this is the end goal. Like, I'm not going to say, oh yeah, it's fine that you're still eating meat, a couple times a week. But I'm also going to try and give them practical steps. And so I think language is really important. And I think it's very subtle in how I approach things. So like, I think it's great. Like, if someone comes to me and says like, oh, I've quit eating, beef, or even I've quit eating meat and I've gone vegetarian, I do sort of congratulate them. I say that's a great step. I am not going to say like, oh no, that's terrible, you're still, torturing cows in the dairy industry. That is, like, in a sense, practically speaking, I do think that, but in an emotional sense, it's like someone is actually trying to take steps and make change. And I think the psychological change of the fact that they've taken a huge step and cut out meat, I think should be supported. So yes, I'll say,
respecting them where they are on their journey and on their path. And I think that's very valid. So Sarina, as we wind this down, do you have any final words you'd like to share with the audience out here?
I would really encourage everyone to think about, are you living in alignment with your values? And if not, what changes can you start making today to start having your actions align with your values? Because, I know it's really popular nowadays to sort of say systemic change instead of individual change. Like, let's blame corporations, let's point the finger and hold these corporations accountable. But at the end of the day, the only thing that we each truly have control over are our personal everyday choices and lives. And so if we aren't willing to make a change and only want to point the finger and call someone else or tell someone else to make a change, do we really care about that change that we want to see? Because if we do, I think that change has to start with us.
Well, I can't thank my guest, Sarina Farb, enough for joining us today. Thank you so much, sharing your heart, your insight, your information. And I urge people to follow Sarina at bornvegan.org. You see it running across the show notes, to follow up on the message that she's sharing to create a more kind and just world through the work that she does as an activist and a scientist herself. And I want to thank everybody that joined us today, because without you, we can't do what we do. And I want to thank you for being part of this very active, healthy community. And on behalf of the National Health Association, I'm your host, Dr. Frank Sabatino, and I look forward to being with you on the next episode of the Health Science Podcast. Sarina, thank you so much. Really, I appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
You've been listening to the Health Science Podcast, brought to you by the National Health Association. Thank you for joining us today and for your commitment to evidence-based health science that backs a whole food, plant-exclusive lifestyle and contributes to the well-being of all people, animals, and our environment. I'm your host, Dr. Frank Sabatino. Be sure to leave a rating and a review, and we'll see you on the next show.